The gunshot echoed through the Montana Valley, just as Josephine Olsen pressed herself against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might give away her hiding spot. It was the spring of 1878, and she had been running for 3 days straight, ever since she fled her uncle's house in Virginia City with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's silver locket tucked beneath her collar. The man hunting her, a wealthy merchant named Gerald Watts who had paid her uncle handsomely for her hand in marriage, was not the kind to give up easily. She could hear his horse crashing through the underbrush somewhere to her left, and she knew her luck was running out. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and Josephine squeezed her eyes shut. She was 22 years old and had never imagined her life would come to this, hiding in the wilderness like a frightened animal. Her parents had died of scarlet fever when she was 16, leaving her in the care of her father's brother, a cruel man who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. When he announced her engagement to Watts, a man nearly 40 years her senior with a reputation for violence toward his previous 2 wives, both of whom had died under suspicious circumstances, Josephine knew she had no choice but to run. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and she pressed harder against the tree, praying for a miracle. Then she heard a different sound, a deeper voice calling out from somewhere ahead. "That is far enough, mister. I suggest you turn that horse around and head back the way you came." Josephine peered carefully around the tree trunk and saw a tall man on horseback blocking the narrow path. He sat easy in his saddle, a rifle resting across his lap, his dark hair just touching the collar of his worn leather coat. Even from a distance, she could see the calm determination in his posture, the kind of stillness that came from a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. "This is none of your concern, cowboy," Watts snarled. "I am looking for my fiancée. She ran away 3 days ago, and I mean to bring her home where she belongs." "Funny thing about that," the stranger said, his voice carrying a hint of Wyoming drawl. "A woman running away from a man usually means she does not want to be found. Seems to me you should respect her wishes." "She is mine by right. Her uncle accepted my payment, and I will have what I paid for." The stranger's voice went cold. "Women are not property, mister. Now I am going to ask you one more time nicely. Turn around and ride out of here, or we are going to have a problem." Josephine watched as Watts reached for his pistol, but the stranger was faster. His rifle came up smooth and steady, the barrel pointing directly at Watts's chest before the merchant could clear leather. "Do not make me do something we will both regret," the stranger said quietly. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other and Josephine held her breath. Then Watts slowly raised his hands, his face twisted with fury. "This is not over," he spat. "I will find her, and when I do, you will pay for interfering. I will take my chances. Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you leave." Watts jerked his horse around and galloped back the way he had come, and Josephine sagged against the tree in relief. The stranger lowered his rifle and turned his horse in a slow circle, scanning the surrounding woods. "You can come out now, miss," he called. "He is gone." For a moment, Josephine hesitated. She had learned the hard way that not all men could be trusted, even those who seemed kind at first. But something in his voice, a gentleness beneath the steel, made her step out from behind the tree. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, her tangled dark hair, and the exhaustion written across her face. His eyes, she noticed, were a warm brown, and they held nothing but concern. "My name is Isaac Foster," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I have a ranch about 5 miles west of here, just outside of Elko. You look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest." "I cannot pay you," Josephine said, her voice hoarse from thirst and fear. "I have nothing." I did not ask for payment. I am offering help, nothing more. He swung down from his horse and pulled a canteen from his saddle. Here, drink this. You look about ready to fall over. The water was cool and sweet, and Josephine had to force herself not to gulp it down too quickly. When she finally lowered the canteen, she found Isaac watching her with those kind eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name is Josephine Olsen. That man, Watts, he wants to force me to marry him. My uncle sold me to him like I was a horse or a piece of furniture." Isaac's jaw tightened. "No one is going to force you to do anything, Miss Olsen. I give you my word on that." He gestured to his horse. "Can you ride? We should get you somewhere safe before that fellow decides to come back with reinforcements." Josephine nodded, and Isaac helped her up into the saddle before swinging up behind her. She stiffened at first, unused to being so close to a man, but Isaac kept a respectful distance, his arms loose on either side of her as he guided the horse through the trees. The ride to his ranch took almost 2 hours, and with each mile, Josephine felt some of the tension drain from her body. Isaac did not press her with questions or demand explanations. He simply rode in silence, occasionally pointing out a landmark or warning her about a low branch. It was the first peace she had known in days, and by the time they emerged from the forest and she saw his ranch spread out in the valley below, she was struggling to keep her eyes open. The ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy cabin, a barn, and several corrals holding horses. As they approached, a yellow dog came bounding out to greet them, tail wagging furiously. "That is Butter," Isaac said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "He is friendly, but he has no sense of personal space. Fair warning." Sure enough, as soon as Isaac helped her down from the horse, Butter was there, pressing his nose into her hand and wiggling with joy. Despite everything, Josephine found herself smiling as she scratched behind his ears. Isaac led her inside the cabin, and Josephine looked around with interest. It was a single large room with a fireplace at one end, a sturdy table and chairs in the middle, and a bed tucked into the far corner. Everything was neat and clean, the floor swept, the dishes washed and stacked on a shelf. "I know it is not much," Isaac said, following her gaze. "But it is warm and dry, and you are welcome to stay as long as you need." Josephine turned to face him, suddenly aware of what he was offering. "I cannot stay here alone with you. It would not be proper. People would talk, and my reputation would be ruined beyond repair." Isaac was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You are right, of course. I should have thought of that." He walked to the window and stood looking out at his land, his hands clasped behind his back. "I will build you a separate bedroom. There is enough lumber in the barn, and I can have it done in a week, maybe less. Until then, you can take my bed and I will sleep in the barn with the horses." "I cannot ask you to do that," Josephine protested. "You have already done so much. You did not ask. I am offering." He turned to face her, and the determination in his eyes took her breath away. "Miss Olsen, I do not know your whole story, and you do not have to tell me unless you want to. But I know a woman in trouble when I see one, and I was raised to believe that a man helps where he can. Let me do this." "Please." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed since fleeing Virginia City. "Thank you," she whispered. "You are very kind, Mr. Foster." "Isaac," he said gently. "Please, just Isaac." That night, Josephine slept in a real bed for the first time in days, her belly full of the stew Isaac had prepared, and her body finally able to relax. When she woke the next morning to the sound of hammering, she found a basin of fresh water waiting for her and a clean dress laid out on a chair. The dress was too big, clearly meant for a larger woman, but it was clean and whole, and Josephine put it on gratefully, cinching the waist with a length of rope she found hanging by the door. She found Isaac behind the cabin, already hard at work framing out the new room. He had stripped down to his shirt and suspenders, and she could see the muscles in his back flex as he swung the hammer. Butter lay in the shade nearby, watching his master with adoring eyes. "Good morning," Isaac called when he noticed her. "There is coffee on the stove and some biscuits in the pan. Help yourself." "Can I help with the building?" Josephine asked. "I am not much use with a hammer, but I can fetch and carry at least." Isaac wiped the sweat from his forehead and gave her a measuring look. "You should be resting." "You have been through an ordeal." "I have been resting. Now I would like to be useful." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. "I am not fragile, Isaac. I may have needed help, but that does not mean I am helpless." A slow smile spread across his face. "Fair enough, Miss Olson. There is a pile of nails in the barn that needs sorting. Think you can handle that?" "I will manage," she said dryly. And he laughed, a warm sound that made something flutter in her chest. They worked together throughout the morning, falling into an easy rhythm. Isaac measured and cut and hammered while Josephine sorted nails and carried lumber and held boards steady while he secured them. They did not talk much, but the silence was comfortable, broken only by the sounds of their work and Butter's occasional bark at a passing bird. By midday, the frame was taking shape, and Josephine could see how it would look when finished. Isaac was building it onto the side of the cabin, with its own door and a window facing east to catch the morning light. It was larger than she had expected, with room for a bed and a dresser and even a small chair. "You are building me a whole house," she said, awed. "Just a bedroom," Isaac corrected, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes at her reaction. Every woman deserves a space of her own, a place where she can be private and comfortable. "Your wife is a lucky woman," Josephine said without thinking, then felt her cheeks burn. "That is, I assumed you were married. The dress you gave me." "That belonged to my mother," Isaac said quietly. "She passed 2 years ago. My father died when I was 16, and it was just the two of us for a long time. She loved this ranch, loved the wide open spaces and the mountains in the distance. When the fever took her, I buried her on that hill over there where she could see it all." "I am so sorry," Josephine said, touching his arm without thinking. "I lost my parents too. I know how it feels, that hollow ache that never quite goes away." Isaac covered her hand with his own, just for a moment. "Then you understand why I could not leave you out there. Life is hard enough without good people turning their backs when someone needs help." They stood there in the Montana sun, hands touching, and Josephine felt something shift inside her. This man, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer, was unlike anyone she had ever known. There was a strength in him, yes, but also a gentleness, a deep well of kindness that showed in everything he did. Over the next week, the bedroom took shape. Isaac worked from dawn until dusk, pausing only for meals and to tend to his horses. Josephine helped where she could, but she also took over the cooking and cleaning, wanting to contribute in whatever way she could manage. She found a strange contentment in these simple domestic tasks, in kneading bread dough and hanging laundry and sweeping the floor while Butter dozed in patches of sunlight. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit outside and watch the sun set over the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. Isaac told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to break horses from his father, and how to read the weather from his mother. Josephine, in turn, found herself sharing memories of her childhood in Philadelphia, before her parents died and her world fell apart. "I always loved books," she confessed one evening. "My father had a whole library, and I read everything I could get my hands on. Poetry, novels, even dry old history books. My uncle sold them all after my parents died, said a woman had no need for such things." Isaac's face darkened. Your uncle sounds like a fool. Intelligence is not something to be ashamed of, regardless of whether you are a man or a woman. Not everyone shares that view, Josephine said softly. Then not everyone is worth listening to. He stood and disappeared into the cabin, returning a moment later with a worn book. This was my mother's favorite. I would be honored if you would read it. Josephine took the book carefully and read the title. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I have heard of this but never read it. Mother used to read passages to me while we worked. I never understood half of what those English folks were going on about, but I loved listening to her voice. He sat back down, stretching his long legs out in front of him. Maybe you could read some to me if you like. It would be nice to hear it again. So Josephine began to read, her voice soft in the gathering darkness, and Isaac listened with his eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. It became their evening ritual, this quiet sharing of words and stories, and Josephine found herself looking forward to it more than she cared to admit. On the 8th day, Isaac put the finishing touches on the bedroom. He had built a simple bed frame and stuffed a mattress with fresh straw and sweet grass. There was a small dresser he had sanded smooth and a peg on the wall for hanging clothes. A rag rug covered the floor, and white curtains fluttered at the window. "It is perfect," Josephine breathed, standing in the doorway. "Isaac, I do not know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," he said, but she could see the pride in his eyes. "You should rest here tonight. I bet it will be nice to have your own space again." That night, Josephine lay in her new bed and stared at the ceiling. The room was lovely, and Isaac had been so thoughtful in every detail. But as she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, she felt oddly lonely. For the past week, she had slept in the main room while Isaac took the barn, but there had been a comfort in knowing he was nearby, in hearing his steady breathing and the occasional pop of the fire. Here, in this separate space, she felt isolated despite its comfort. She tried to tell herself she was being foolish, that this was exactly what propriety demanded. But as the hours ticked by and sleep refused to come, Josephine found herself thinking about Isaac's kindness, his gentle humor, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Finally, unable to bear the loneliness any longer, Josephine rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She padded quietly through her door and across to the main cabin, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Through the window, she could see Isaac sitting at the table, working by lamplight on what looked like a piece of leather tack. She knocked softly, and he looked up in surprise. When he opened the door, concern flooded his face. "Is something wrong?" "Is the room not comfortable?" "The room is perfect," Josephine assured him, "but I cannot sleep. I feel too far away, too separate." "Isaac, I know we built it for propriety's sake, but the truth is I feel safer when you are near. Would it be terribly improper if I slept in here in the main room? I promise I will use the bedroom during the day, when people might come calling, but at night." She trailed off, suddenly embarrassed, but Isaac was already nodding. "I understand," he said gently. "And I will not lie, I have been sleeping poorly myself, worried about whether you were comfortable, whether you were safe. If you want to sleep in here, that is fine by me. We will move my mother's old bed in from the barn tomorrow, and you can have it set up by the fireplace. That way, you will have your privacy but still be close if you need anything." Relief flooded through Josephine. "Thank you for understanding." "Always," Isaac said, and the warmth in his voice made her heart skip. They moved the bed the next day, and true to his word, Isaac set it up in a corner where the fireplace would keep it warm. But that night, and every night after, Josephine found reasons to stay up late, talking with Isaac by lamplight or reading to him from his mother's books. And when she finally did go to bed, she fell asleep to the comforting sound of his presence, the quiet rustle of him moving about the cabin, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The separate bedroom became a place where she kept her clothes and spent time during the day when she wanted to read or think in private. But she never slept there, not after that first lonely night. 3 weeks after Josephine arrived at the ranch, a rider came up the path, and Isaac stepped out to meet him with his rifle in hand. Josephine watched from the window, her heart pounding, but the visitor raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I am not looking for trouble," the man called. "Name is Sheriff Tom Briggs from Virginia City. I am looking for a Miss Josephine Olsen." Isaac did not lower the rifle. "What is your business with her?" "Just want to talk, make sure she is all right. Her uncle reported her missing, said she ran off with some of his money." "That is a lie," Josephine said, stepping out onto the porch. "I never took a cent from my uncle. I only took what belonged to me, my mother's locket and the clothes on my back." The sheriff looked at her, his weathered face thoughtful. "That is what I figured. Your uncle struck me as the kind of man who would say anything to get what he wants. Gerald Watts has been making noise too, saying you are his betrothed and he has a right to claim you." "I never agreed to marry him," Josephine said firmly. "My uncle arranged it without my consent." "Watts is a dangerous man, Sheriff. His previous wives both died under suspicious circumstances." "I am aware of that," Briggs said quietly. "Truth is, I have been wanting to look into those deaths for a while now, but Watts has powerful friends. Your uncle too." He paused, then said carefully, "But if you were married to someone else, well, that would solve the problem neat and clean. Watts would have no claim on you, and your uncle could not force the issue." Josephine felt Isaac tense beside her. "I will not marry just to escape one trap and fall into another." "Even if the man is of your choosing?" the sheriff asked. "Look, miss, I am not saying you have to marry anyone, but the law is not always on the side of justice, especially when it comes to women and family disputes. If you stay unmarried, Watts might find a judge willing to rule in his favor. But if you have a husband, a good man who will stand up for you, that changes everything." After the sheriff left, promising to keep Josephine's location quiet as long as he could, she and Isaac sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Isaac spoke. "He is right, you know. As long as you are unmarried, you are vulnerable. Watts could get a court order, force you back to Virginia City. But if we were married, legally you would be my wife, under my protection. No judge could hand you over to another man." Josephine's heart hammered in her chest. "Isaac, I cannot ask you to do that. Marriage is meant to be about love, about two people choosing each other freely. Not a legal maneuver to protect someone from a terrible situation." Isaac turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "What if it were both? What if I wanted to marry you, not just to protect you, but because I have come to care for you deeply? Josephine, these past weeks with you have been the happiest I have known since my mother died. I love your intelligence, your strength, the way you refuse to be defeated even when life has dealt you terrible hands. I love reading with you in the evenings and working beside you during the day. I love your laugh and your stubbornness and the way you scratch butter behind his ears. If you will have me, I would be honored to be your husband for protection, yes, but also because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, telling myself it was too soon, that I barely know you, but the heart does not listen to reason. You are the kindest, most honorable man I have ever known, and yes, Isaac Foster, I will marry you." Isaac pulled her into his arms, and Josephine went willingly, burying her face against his chest. He smelled of leather and wood smoke and clean sweat, and she had never felt safer in her life. They were married the following week in a simple ceremony at the small church in Elko. Sheriff Briggs stood as witness, along with a few of Isaac's neighbors who Josephine had met briefly when they came to buy horses. She wore the dress that had belonged to Isaac's mother, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers Isaac had picked that morning. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her gently, and Josephine felt her whole world shift into place. This was where she belonged, here with this good man in this wild, beautiful country. The celebration was modest but joyful. Isaac's neighbors brought food and well wishes, and someone produced a fiddle, filling the small church with lively music. Josephine danced with her new husband, laughing as he admitted he had 2 left feet and stepped on her toes more than once. As the sun began to set, they rode back to the ranch together, Isaac's arm around her waist. Butter raced alongside them, barking joyfully, and Josephine felt drunk on happiness. That night, as they prepared for bed, Josephine paused by the door to the separate bedroom. "I suppose I should sleep in there now," she said teasingly. "After all, we went to all that trouble to build it for Propriety." Isaac came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Or you could sleep where you have been sleeping every night since that first one, right here close to me." "What will people think?" Josephine asked, but she was already turning in his arms, smiling up at him. "I think people will understand that a husband and wife belong together," Isaac murmured, lowering his head to kiss her. "Besides, that room has served its purpose. It gave you a place of your own when you needed it, and it satisfied Propriety when Propriety mattered. But now you are my wife, Josephine Foster, and if you want to be close to me at night, then that is exactly where you should be." Josephine kissed him back, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "I have one request," she said softly. "Anything. Can we turn that bedroom into something else? Maybe a library where we can keep books and spend quiet afternoons reading together." Isaac's smile was radiant. "I think that is a perfect idea." In the months that followed, they transformed the separate bedroom into exactly that. Isaac built shelves along the walls, and Josephine filled them with books, some ordered from catalogs, others purchased on trips to town. She added a comfortable chair by the window and a small desk where she could write letters or keep accounts for the ranch. But she never spent a single night there. Instead, she slept beside Isaac, sometimes wrapped in his arms, sometimes simply holding his hand across the space between their pillows. On cold winter nights, they would huddle close together under thick quilts, and on warm summer evenings, they would fall asleep to the sound of crickets and the gentle rustle of wind through the grass. Life on the ranch was not easy. There were droughts and hard winters, times when money was tight and the work seemed endless. But they faced it together, Isaac's steady strength complementing Josephine's quick mind and determination. She learned to ride and rope, to help with the horses and mend tack. He learned to appreciate poetry and long conversations about ideas and philosophy. In the spring of 1879, Josephine discovered she was with child. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. Isaac became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work until she finally sat him down and reminded him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and that she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. "I am not made of glass," she said firmly. "This baby is a blessing, not an illness." Their son was born in January of 1880 during a howling snowstorm that kept the doctor from reaching them in time. Isaac delivered the baby himself with shaking hands while Josephine gritted her teeth and did the hard work of bringing new life into the world. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and squalling, Isaac wept openly as he placed the tiny boy in his mother's arms. They named him James, after Josephine's father, and he was the image of his daddy with dark hair and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. Josephine had never known love like this existed. Watching Isaac cradle their son with such tenderness, seeing the wonder in his face every time James grasped his finger or made a small sound. The years passed in a blur of happiness. James grew into a sturdy little boy who followed his father everywhere, chattering endlessly and asking 1,000 questions about horses and cattle, and why the sky was blue. In 1882, they had a daughter, Clara, who had her mother's dark hair and stubborn chin. She was followed 2 years later by another boy, Thomas, who was quieter than his siblings but had a gift for gentling even the wildest horses. Through it all, the bedroom that Isaac had built for Propriety remained their library, a quiet sanctuary filled with books and memories. Josephine would sometimes sit there in the afternoons, watching her children play in the yard through the window, and marvel at how much her life had changed. She thought about that terrified young woman hiding behind a tree, running from a man who saw her as property. She thought about Isaac riding up like something out of a story, offering help with no thought of reward. She thought about those early days, the careful dance of propriety and longing, and how that separate bedroom had represented everything they were trying to maintain, and everything they secretly wanted to abandon. In the fall of 1887, word reached them that Gerald Watts had died, thrown from his horse in a drunken rage. Josephine felt nothing but pity for the man, who had spent his whole life trying to own and control others, and had died alone and unmourned. Her uncle had passed the previous year, and with both men gone, the last shadows of her old life finally lifted. She stood at the window of the library one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, when Isaac came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, just as he had on their wedding night. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, resting his chin on her shoulder. "About how lucky I am," Josephine said, leaning back against him. "About how this room was supposed to keep us apart, and instead it became one more place where we can be together." "I built it for propriety," Isaac said thoughtfully, "but you never slept there after the first night." "Because I did not need a separate room," Josephine said, turning in his arms to face him. "I needed you. I needed to feel safe and loved and cherished, and you gave me all of that and more." Isaac kissed her softly. "You gave me just as much. You brought light and laughter back into this house. You gave me a family and a future I never dared dream of. Every day with you is a gift, Josephine." They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of love and purpose. Outside, they could hear their children's voices raised in play, Butter's joyful barking, and the gentle sounds of the ranch settling in for the evening. As the years continued to unfold, the ranch prospered. Isaac's reputation as a horse breeder spread throughout Montana and beyond, and buyers came from as far as Wyoming and the Dakotas to purchase his stock. Josephine kept meticulous records and managed the finances with a skill that impressed even the most hardened ranchers in the territory. She also became known for her literacy work, teaching neighboring children and even some adults to read and write. The library that had once been a bedroom for propriety's sake became a schoolroom 2 afternoons a week, filled with eager students of all ages. Isaac would watch sometimes from the doorway, his heart swelling with pride as his wife patiently sounded out words and encouraged struggling readers. James grew into a fine young man, tall and steady like his father, with his mother's sharp mind. He took to ranching naturally, understanding horses in a way that could not be taught, only felt. Clara was fiercely independent, insisting on learning to rope and ride as well as any boy, and Josephine encouraged her, remembering her own struggles against the limitations people tried to place on women. Thomas, true to his gentle nature, became the family mediator, able to soothe tempers and find compromise when conflicts arose. In 1892, Clara came home from town with news that made Josephine's blood run cold. A man had been asking questions about the Foster family, specifically about when Isaac and Josephine had married and where Josephine had come from. He said he was a lawyer from Virginia City, Clara reported, her young face worried. He seemed very interested in Mother's background. Isaac and Josephine exchanged glances. After all these years, they had hoped that part of her past was buried for good. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat in the library and talked about what to do. It could be nothing, Isaac said, but his jaw was tight. Or it could be someone trying to stir up old trouble. My uncle is dead, and Watts is dead, Josephine said, trying to think through all the possibilities. Who would have an interest in my past now? The answer came 3 days later when Sheriff Briggs, now gray-haired but still sharp-eyed, rode up to the ranch. He was accompanied by a dapper man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Harold Pemberton, attorney at law. Mr. and Mrs. Foster, Pemberton said, I represent the estate of Marcus Olson, Josephine's uncle. As you may know, he passed away some years ago, but his estate has only recently been settled. It seems he had some investments that have proven quite valuable, and as his only living relative, Josephine is entitled to a substantial inheritance. Josephine stared at him in shock. I do not want anything from that man. He sold me like cattle and would have let Watts destroy me if I had not run. I understand your feelings, Mrs. Foster, Pemberton said gently, but the law is clear. As his niece and sole heir, the money is rightfully yours. We are talking about a considerable sum, nearly $10,000. Isaac let out a low whistle. $10,000 was a fortune, more money than most people saw in a lifetime. It could expand the ranch, secure their children's futures, provide for grandchildren not yet born. There is one complication, Pemberton continued. Before his death, your uncle made certain claims about your departure from Virginia City. He alleged that you stole money and jewelry from him. Obviously, we now know those claims were false, but there was never any official resolution. To claim your inheritance without any legal challenges, we need to formally clear your name. That would require you to give a deposition and possibly testify about the circumstances of your leaving Virginia City and your subsequent marriage to Mr. Foster. Will Gerald Watts's name come up? Josephine asked quietly. Almost certainly. The circumstances of your uncle attempting to force you into marriage with a man of ill repute is central to explaining why you fled and why the theft allegations were fabricated. Josephine was silent for a long moment. Then she said, I will do it. Not for the money, though that will certainly help our family, but because I am tired of running from the truth. I want my story told, my name cleared. I want it known that I did nothing wrong except refuse to be a victim. The deposition took place in Elko, in the same courthouse where she and Isaac had signed their marriage certificate. Josephine sat straight-backed in the witness chair and told her story without flinching. She spoke about her parents' deaths, her uncle's cruelty, the forced engagement to a man she knew to be dangerous. She described her flight through the wilderness and Isaac's timely intervention. And when did you come to love your husband? Pemberton asked gently. Josephine smiled. I think I started falling in love with him the moment he stood between me and danger, asking nothing in return but the chance to help. But I knew for certain during those days when he was building the bedroom, working from dawn to dusk, to ensure my reputation would be protected. He was thinking of my welfare, my comfort, my future. How could I not love a man like that? And the bedroom he built, do you use it? I slept there one night, Josephine said clearly. The first night it was finished, but it felt wrong being separated from him. Not because of anything improper, but because I had come to feel safe when he was near. So I asked if I could sleep in the main room, and he agreed. We turned the separate bedroom into a library instead. Some might say that was inappropriate, an unmarried woman sleeping in the same room as a man. Then we were married within days of that conversation, so it hardly matters. And even if we had not been, I would make the same choice. Propriety is important, but survival is more important. Safety is more important. And sometimes, love is more important too. The room was silent when she finished. Then the judge, an elderly man who had presided over the territory for 30 years, nodded slowly. "I believe I have heard enough," he said. "It is clear to me that Miss Olson, now Mrs. Foster, acted with courage and good judgment in fleeing an intolerable situation. The allegations of theft are hereby dismissed as unfounded. The inheritance from Marcus Olson's estate shall be released to Josephine Foster without delay." He paused, then added, "And might I say, Mrs. Foster, that your uncle was a fool. He had a treasure in you and treated you like trash. I am glad you found a man who knows your worth." The money, when it came, transformed their lives. Isaac was able to buy additional land and expand the horse breeding operation. They built a larger house, though Josephine insisted that the library from the old cabin be dismantled board by board and rebuilt in the new home, books and all. "That room represents everything we fought for," she said. "The struggle between what society expected and what our hearts needed. I want it preserved exactly as it was." They hired help for the ranch, which freed up time for Isaac to teach James the finer points of breeding and training, and for Josephine to expand her teaching. She even traveled to Helena once to speak at a women's education conference, sharing her story and advocating for literacy programs across Montana. But no matter how much their circumstances changed, some things remained constant. Every evening, they would gather in the library, the family reading together or discussing the day's events. And every night, Josephine and Isaac would retire to their bedroom together, the separate space that had been built for propriety long since repurposed and forgotten as anything but a symbol of how far they had come. In 1895, James married a schoolteacher from Elko named Sarah, and they built a small house on the eastern edge of the ranch property. The following year, Sarah gave birth to Isaac and Josephine's first grandchild, a boy they named Isaac Jr. Holding that tiny baby in her arms, Josephine was overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had been given. "I could have died in those woods," she whispered to Isaac one night as they watched their grandson sleep. "If you had not come along when you did, Watts might have found me. Or I might have starved or frozen. Everything I have, everything we have built, it all traces back to that moment when you chose to help a stranger. And you chose to trust me," Isaac reminded her. "That took just as much courage. You had every reason to be suspicious of men, to assume the worst. But you took a chance on me, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that trust." Clara married in 1898, choosing a young doctor who had come to Montana to establish a practice. Josephine approved heartily, seeing in the young man the same quiet strength and dedication that she loved in Isaac. Thomas, always the surprise, announced his intention to attend university in the East, wanting to study veterinary medicine. "The ranch will always be here," Isaac assured him. "Go, learn, expand your horizons. You can come back and help us raise the healthiest horses in Montana." As the new century approached, Elko grew from a small frontier town into a thriving community. The railroad came through, bringing new people and new opportunities. But the Foster Ranch remained a constant, a place of stability and love in a changing world. Josephine continued her teaching until she was well into her 60s, finally retiring when her eyesight began to fail, and the long hours of reading became too taxing. By then, she had taught hundreds of students, some of whom had gone on to become teachers themselves, spreading literacy across the territory and beyond. Isaac, too, eventually handed over the day-to-day running of the ranch to James, though he still spent every morning in the stables, talking to the horses and advising his son on breeding decisions. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his mind was sharp, and his love for the animals never dimmed. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were now 7 grandchildren, ranging in age from infant to young adult, and the house rang with their laughter and noise. That evening, as the party wound down and the younger children were put to bed, Isaac took Josephine's hand and led her to the library. It looked much as it had all those years ago, though the shelves now groaned under the weight of hundreds of books, and the desk was scarred from decades of use. "You remember the first night in this room?" Isaac asked. "When you came to the door and told me you could not sleep in here, that you needed to be close to me. I remember being terrified that you would think I was being forward or inappropriate," Josephine said, smiling at the memory. "I had rehearsed a whole speech about safety and propriety, but in the end, I just blurted out the truth. I am glad you did. That was the night I knew for certain that what I felt for you was real and lasting. You could have hidden behind propriety, could have forced yourself to stay in that separate room even though it made you miserable. But instead, you were honest about what you needed. That courage, that honesty, it is what I have always loved most about you." Josephine reached up to touch his face, now lined and weathered but still dear beyond measure. "You built me a room for propriety, but what I needed was your love. You gave me that freely and without reservation, and it changed everything." They stood together in the library, surrounded by the books and memories of a lifetime, and kissed as they had on their wedding day, with tenderness and passion and profound gratitude. Outside, through the window, they could see their family gathered on the porch, 3 generations of Fosters laughing and talking as the Montana sun set over the mountains. This was the legacy they had built together, not just children and grandchildren, but a family rooted in love and respect, and the courage to be honest about what they needed. The separate bedroom had served its purpose all those years ago, providing the appearance of propriety when propriety mattered. But Josephine had never slept there after the first night, and in that choice, in that brave decision to be close to the man she loved, she had set the course for everything that followed. As they rejoined their family, Isaac's arm around Josephine's waist, she thought about the young woman she had been, frightened and alone in the wilderness. That woman could never have imagined this life, this abundance of love and purpose. But she had taken the chances when they came, had trusted when trust was risky, and had loved when love seemed impossible. And in the end, that had made all the difference. The years continued their steady march, bringing both joys and sorrows as all years do. In 1922, they lost Clara to pneumonia, a devastating blow that shook the entire family. Isaac and Josephine held each other through the grief, drawing on the deep well of strength they had built over decades together. She lived fully, Josephine said through her tears. She never let anyone tell her what she could not do. I am proud of the woman she became. She was like her mother, Isaac said softly, strong and brave and determined to make her own path. Thomas returned from the East with his degree and a wife, a fellow student he had met at university. Together, they established a veterinary practice that served ranchers throughout the region. James and Sarah's children grew and married, bringing even more family into the fold. In 1925, Isaac suffered a stroke that left him weakened on his left side. He fought hard to regain his strength, driven by his fierce independence and Josephine's unwavering support. Though he never fully recovered, he adapted, learning to do familiar tasks in new ways and refusing to surrender to despair. "I am not done yet," he told Josephine stubbornly when she suggested he might want to rest more. "I still have years left with you, and I intend to make the most of every one of them." True to his word, Isaac continued to be active in ranch life, advising James and spending hours with his grandchildren, telling them stories of the old days when Montana was still wild and untamed. His favorite stories were always about how he met their grandmother, and the children never tired of hearing about the bedroom built for Propriety that was never used for sleeping. "Why did you build it if Grandma was not going to sleep there?" one grandchild asked, confused. "Because at the time, it was the right thing to do," Isaac explained. "We did not know yet what our future would hold, but we knew we wanted to do things properly, to give your grandmother the respect and protection she deserved. Sometimes you do something because it is right, even if it ends up not being necessary. And sometimes," Josephine added, "you realize that what society says is proper and what your heart says is right are not always the same thing. The important part is being honest with yourself and the people you love about what you truly need." In the spring of 1928, as new life burst forth across the ranch and the mountains shed their winter snow, Isaac and Josephine celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The celebration was smaller than the 40th had been, limited by Isaac's health and Josephine's own advancing age, but no less joyful. They sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching their family gathered below. There were now 12 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, a sprawling network of fosters who carried their legacy forward into an uncertain future. 50 years, Josephine marveled. "It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "Best 50 years of my life," Isaac said, his speech slightly slurred from the stroke but his meaning clear. "I would do it all again exactly the same way. Even building that bedroom I never slept in." Josephine teased gently. Isaac laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "Especially that. It was important, what it represented. The care we took with each other, the respect we had even when we barely knew each other. That foundation, that careful building of trust and propriety, it made everything else possible." "I suppose you are right," Josephine agreed. "We could not have jumped straight to the intimacy and partnership we have now. We needed those early days, those careful steps, to learn each other and build something lasting." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isaac took Josephine's hand. His grip was weaker than it once had been, but the love behind it was as strong as ever. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me all those years ago, for building this life with me, for every morning I woke up to find you beside me, and every evening we spent reading together. For our children and their children, for everything." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder, careful of his weakened side. "Thank you for riding into my life when I needed you most, for seeing me as a person worthy of respect and protection. For loving me not despite my stubbornness and independence, but because of it. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. The separate bedroom, long since transformed into a library and now preserved in their family's stories, remained a symbol of everything they had navigated together. The balance between propriety and passion, between society's expectations and the heart's true needs. Isaac passed away peacefully in his sleep in the autumn of 1929, just as the leaves were turning gold and the first cold winds began to blow down from the mountains. Josephine woke to find him still beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still clasped in hers. She sat with him for a long time, not crying yet, just being present with the man who had shared her life for more than 50 years. "Thank you," she whispered, kissing his weathered forehead. "Thank you for everything." The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Montana. Ranchers and businessmen, former students and family friends, all came to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and kindness. Josephine stood straight-backed and dry-eyed through the service, drawing on the same strength that had carried her through every challenge life had thrown at her. But that night, alone in the bedroom they had shared for so many years, she finally wept, grieving for the loss of her partner, her love, her dearest friend. In the days that followed, family and friends worried that Josephine would fade without Isaac, that losing her anchor would set her adrift. But they underestimated the strength she had always possessed, the resilience that had allowed her to survive her uncle's cruelty and build a new life in the wilderness. "Isaac would not want me to give up," she told James when he suggested she might want to move in with him and Sarah. "He would want me to keep living fully, to keep teaching and reading and spending time with my grandchildren. That is exactly what I intend to do." And she did. Josephine lived another 15 years, remaining active and engaged until the very end. She wrote her memoirs, a frank and sometimes startling account of her life that became required reading for women's studies programs across the country. She continued teaching literacy, adapting her methods for the changing times but never wavering in her conviction that education was the key to freedom. She also made sure that the library, that room that had been built for propriety and transformed by love, was preserved exactly as it had been. She donated it to the local historical society, complete with the original books and furniture, stipulating that it be maintained as a museum dedicated to the history of women in the Montana Territory. "This room represents a moment in time," she explained to the Historical Society director. "A moment when a good man tried to do the right thing, and a frightened woman took a chance on trust. What happened next, the choice to be honest about our needs rather than hide behind propriety, that shaped everything that followed. I want people to understand that sometimes the rules we follow are less important than the love we share." Josephine passed away in her sleep in 1944, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were about Isaac, about how she would see him soon and they could read together again the way they used to. She was buried beside him on the hill overlooking the ranch, where they could see the mountains and the wide Montana sky. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and the dates of their lives, but also an inscription chosen by their children. He built her a room for propriety. She chose love instead. The ranch continued under James's management, and then his sons, remaining in the foster family through generations. The library museum became a beloved local attraction, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to see the room and hear the story of the couple who had navigated the complex terrain between propriety and passion. Tour guides would stand in the doorway and tell visitors about Isaac building the bedroom, about Josephine sleeping there one night, and then choosing to be close to the man she was coming to love. They would talk about how that choice, that brave honesty, had set the foundation for a marriage that lasted 50 years and produced a legacy of love and strength. The separate bedroom was never really about sleeping, one guide explained to a group of schoolchildren. It was about respect and care and doing what seemed right at the time. But when Josephine chose not to use it after that first night, she was making an even more important choice. She was choosing honesty over appearances, connection over isolation, love over fear. And that choice changed everything. The children would peer into the preserved room, at the shelves of old books and the simple furniture, trying to imagine a time when such things mattered so much. Some understood immediately, sensing the deeper truth beneath the story. Others would puzzle over it, wondering why it was such a big deal. But they all left with the understanding that sometimes the most important moments in life are the quiet ones, the private choices we make about who to trust and how to love and whether to follow the rules or listen to our hearts. In the decades that followed, the story of Isaac and Josephine Foster became part of Montana folklore, a tale passed down through generations and adapted for different audiences. Romance novelists found inspiration in their courtship. Historians analyzed the social context of their choices, and feminists celebrated Josephine's courage in fleeing an intolerable situation and building a new life on her own terms. But at its heart, it remained a simple story of a man who offered help when help was needed and a woman who was brave enough to accept it. Of a bedroom built for propriety that became a symbol of something deeper and more lasting. Of two people who found each other in the wilderness and chose, every single day, to keep choosing each other. The ranch still stands today, now run by the 6th generation of Fosters. The library remains preserved in the old cabin, carefully maintained and open to visitors who want to understand a different time, and the universal truths about love and courage that transcend any era. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the Montana wind whispers through the grass, and the sun sets over the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, locals swear they can see two figures on the hill, holding hands and watching over the land they loved. Isaac and Josephine, together still, just as they chose to be from that first night when propriety said they should be apart, but love said they belonged together. The bedroom built for propriety stands empty, as it has for over 100 years. But it is not forgotten. It remains a testament to the complexity of love, to the dance between what is expected and what is needed, between the appearance of virtue and the reality of it. Isaac built it with care and dedication, every board and nail a declaration of his respect for the woman he was coming to love. Josephine honored that respect by sleeping there once, acknowledging the gift and the intention behind it. But then she chose differently, chose honesty and closeness, and the comfort of being near the man who made her feel safe. And in that choice, in that brave rejection of isolation in favor of connection, she set the course for a love story that would span 50 years and echo through generations. That is the true legacy of the bedroom that was never used for sleeping. Not the room itself, but what it represented. The careful balance between respect and love, between propriety and passion, between doing what is expected and doing what is right. Isaac and Josephine Foster navigated that balance with grace and courage, and in doing so, they built something far more enduring than any wooden structure. They built a love that weathered every storm, a partnership that strengthened with each passing year, and a legacy that continues to inspire everyone who hears their story. He built a second bedroom for propriety. She never slept there after the first night. And in that choice, in that moment of brave honesty, they created something beautiful and lasting, A love story for the ages set against the wild backdrop of Montana Territory in the late 19th century. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is be honest about what we need, even when it goes against expectations. That love requires courage, not just in grand gestures but in small daily choices. That respect and passion are not opposites but partners, each strengthening the other. And that sometimes, the rooms we build for one purpose end up serving another entirely, transforming from symbols of separation into symbols of the journey two people took together, from strangers to partners, to lovers, to the kind of soul-deep connection that transcends death itself. The Foster family still gathers every year on the anniversary of Isaac and Josephine's wedding, a tradition now spanning over a century. They come from across the country, descendants of those 3 children born in the early years of the marriage, and they stand together on the hill where their ancestors are buried. They tell the story again, making sure each new generation understands where they came from. They talk about courage and love, and the choices we make when life backs us into corners. They honor the memory of a man who offered help without asking for anything in return, and a woman who was brave enough to trust when trust seemed impossible. And they remember the bedroom built for Propriety, standing empty in the old cabin, a monument to the complex dance of love and respect, and the courage it takes to be honest about what we truly need. That is the story of Isaac and Josephine Foster, of a love born in the wilderness and nurtured through 50 years of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. It is a story about doing what is right, even when right is complicated. About building foundations of respect and trust before building anything else. About having the courage to change course when your heart leads you in a different direction than propriety demands. Most of all, it is a story about love, the kind that lasts, the kind that transforms, the kind that echoes through generations and reminds us all that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple choice to trust, to hope, and to allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to accept help when we need it most. He built a second bedroom for Propriety. She never slept there after the first night. And in that choice, they built a love that would last forever.